Good evening. I'm Gayatri Kant, the Interim Library Director of the Palo Alto Library. Welcome to our first 2021 Summer Reading Author Event. This is an author event which is also a result of our year-long collaboration with Stanford's Bill Lane Center that has resulted in some really wonderful author events. And tonight, it's my pleasure to introduce you to the author, Shanthi Sekaran, and the moderator, Paula Moya. Shanthi Sekaran is a novelist and television writer. Her novel, Lucky Boy, was named an Indie Next Great Read, an Amazon editor's pick, and a best book of 2017 by NPR, Barnes & Noble, Library Journal, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, The Rumpus, Salon.com, and Canteen Magazine. Her forthcoming middle grade novel, The Samosa Rebellion, will be out in fall 2021. She recently left a teaching career to join the writer's room of the acclaimed NBC medical drama, New Amsterdam. Our moderator for the event, Paula Moya, is the Daniele C. and Laura Louise Bell Professor of Humanities and Professor of English at Stanford University, the author of 2 scholarly monographs and 3 edited collections. Her teaching and research focused on feminist theory, narrative theory, interdisciplinary approaches to race and ethnicity, and Chicanx and Latinx studies. In fall 2021, Paula will take up the position of Director of the Center of Comparative Studies in Race and Ethnicity at Stanford. Please join me in welcoming Shanthi and Paula.
Thank you, Gayatri. Let me just say hello, first of all, to Shanthi Sekaran. I'm so pleased to be able to be here, actually, and to be able to talk to you about this tremendous novel that you've written. I'm really pleased to have been asked to moderate this because it introduced me not only to the novel, which is fabulous, but also to you. And so I'm looking forward to your forthcoming book, novel, Samosa Rebellion. And hopefully by the end of this time, I'll be able to ask you a little bit about that. So yes, I'm not quite sure how I missed this amazing novel, but I'm thrilled actually to have a chance to talk to you. So I'm guessing that a lot of people who are joining us today will have read the novel, perhaps the first time it came around, or maybe recently for this event. But I thought it might be a good place to start with if you would talk a little bit about the origin of the novel. So in a previous talk, you mentioned hearing a story about an undocumented woman from Guatemala, Encarnacion Bell Romero, who lost her son to a Missouri couple who had fostered him from the age of 11 months. And so I can say more about that, but let me turn it over to you and let you talk about how that sort of got this going for you.
Sure, yeah. Well, first of all, thank you, Paula, for running this discussion, and thanks everyone who's come tonight, and thank you to the Palo Alto Library and the Bill Lane Center for the West. It's really an honor to be here. So to talk a little about the origin of this book, for me, it started back in 2011, actually. I heard the news story that Paula, you just mentioned, about this Guatemalan woman who was fighting for custody of her son, who was being basically adopted away from her without her permission. And when I heard that, it was a very short radio clip. And with those news stories, you don't get, as a storyteller, I wanted the story and I didn't get the story.
Right.
I also didn't feel that it was my role to tell Encarnacion's story specifically. You know, I wasn't really a journalist. It wasn't the part of the narrative that I wanted to plug into. What I was really interested in was the contradictions and complexities in a story like this, because you have a mother who is a child's biological mother, who should have every right to keep him if she chooses. And then you have a couple who are trying to adopt him away from her, And the interesting thing for me was that they were doing that as an act of love. They were doing that because they loved this boy. And yet they were throwing this mother's life into an absolute nightmare, really. And that's what I wanted to actually look at. So I got started. I got started with research and kind of went from there.
Well, so it seems pretty clear that you would have had to do a good deal of research to really tell this particular story, because while I can imagine that just, growing up, being, from Sacramento, being from this Bay Area, you might know in some way Kavia's story, but to tell Soli's story couldn't have been something you just made up. It was too realistic. It felt too true. So I'm wondering, what did you have to learn to write the story, and how did you learn it? What was your research process?
Right. So it was a big learning curve, as you said. I didn't know a lot about the undocumented experience. I didn't know much about immigration policy or what that experience was like. So I went through, as I was writing, I went through probably 3 years of research. Speaking to anyone who would talk to me, really, policy experts, lawyers, a psychologist who works with undocumented immigrants. I visited a detention center in Richmond, California, back when that existed. It's been since closed, I believe, and worked with some advocacy groups as well. Probably one of the most pivotal things that I did for this book was to actually go to Mexico myself. It was feeling very make-believe until I did that, until I actually went and stepped on, the ground of a town like the one that Soli was from. That's when I started to feel like, okay, maybe I can not just tell the story, but feel the story. I think that was really important. I had to physically feel, the air in that town. I had to see the landscape. I had to see the people. I had to observe how people interacted and why they interacted and what their social rituals were like. So I got to do that for only a couple weeks. I just made the most of those 2 weeks. It was this little town outside of Oaxaca. I took all the notes I could. I talked to people. I walked around. I went to a festival in the village. And at a certain point, I had to take this research and kind of keep it in mind, but also step away from the things I didn't know and plug into the things that I did know about this character, because this ultimately had to be a story that I told, a story that was mine to tell. And I had to find a way to make that possible. So I plugged into Soli's character through motherhood, through being a young woman who wanted to move forward with her life, through being an immigrant to some extent. I've been an immigrant. I lived in England for 6 years. Not the same exactly,
Yes.
but it is an immigration experience. So I kind of started with what I didn't know and then shifted to what I could know.
Well, there's like 2 questions. I want to go in 2 different directions. I'll let you choose one. Obviously, this is a story about immigration, right? And in this novel, we have 2 very different kinds of immigrants, right? We have the Indian immigrant community that came here largely as professionals, documented, were able to stay, accumulate capital. And then you have the undocumented experience, which is Soli's experience and her coming across. And so, each of these kinds of things were formed by the histories and economic situations, their communities. And so I think you're telling, what was amazing was how you managed to handle both at the same time. And so, and several of your readers in talking about this novel have really described their own emotional reactions to what happens to Soli in particular on her trek across the border when she is working, working to get here. And so, I'm guessing that, since I'm assuming you didn't ride La Bestia yourself, there had to be a certain amount of yourself that you put into this character. I don't know if you want to talk about the extent to which Soli is partially you.
Yeah, I definitely had to make myself a part of Soli. So, I was able to research those trains. There's some great documentaries about La Bestia. I read about it, but ultimately I had to put myself on that train. And one go-to that I think writers use a lot is when you don't know, when you don't have an experience yourself, you try to imagine the physicality of that experience. So just the physicality of running alongside this enormous moving vehicle, climbing a ladder while it's moving. I mean, these are things that people do, and it's absolutely mind-boggling. And for Soli to do this, you know, I had to first plug into that physicality. That helped a lot. I asked myself, what would it be like to be 19 years old and, you know, knowing that despite her parents' efforts to give her a safe passage, to set her up in the most secure way possible, knowing that ultimately she would have to, for her own safety, shuck that setup that they'd given her, and really just be on her own with Jacob, of course.
Yes, I thought it was amazing the way she, escaped. I guess it was Manuel, was his name, the guy who was the drug smuggler, I guess, who was planning to use her as a small young woman to smuggle drugs into the country. And so she showed a lot of pluck, if you will, in learning to escape him and choosing basically somebody else to help her along, which of course is Checo.
Yeah.
And Checo is a lovely character, not very, I mean, he's there, he's almost mythic, if you will. He's not there very long. But you know, he ends up being presumptively the father of her child. But you introduce an element of uncertainty about that too. So you want to talk about that?
Yeah. In terms of the assault that she underwent, or yeah. So from my research, I learned that something like 60 to 80% of women are sexually assaulted when they're making the border crossing from Mexico, on both sides of the border. And as a writer, I had to calibrate what I was going to put Soli through. Because all kinds of things happen. People are kidnapped, they're held for ransom. I mean, there's a long list of trials that people are put through when they're crossing that border. So I had to decide what was going to have to happen to Soli. It couldn't be everything. It had to be something that meant something to the story later on. And I had to tell it, I tried to tell it in a way that was not, that did not turn into trauma porn. You know, I didn't want it to be a voyeuristic experience when we saw what happened to Soli. So I worked with memory, and the way memory works is, as we all know, memory circles around. You know, sometimes we suppress it, it comes back. We'll be making a salad one day, it'll come back then. It's this constantly sort of churning and circling phenomenon. So I worked with that and didn't tell the reader everything at once.
I'd like to just compliment you on that. I really did appreciate that, you know, that we got her there, and then it only came back little by little. And I mean, both also what happened to Checo, you know, so, and if she doesn't know that, she doesn't know till almost near the end of the book what happened to Checo. But I thought it was very effective just as a reader to see how you dropped that in little by little so that we could get the full experience without it being, as you say, trauma porn. So good, that's just great. I don't know if you learned that in your just from reading other books, or if it's a technique that was something that came up in your writing programs, or.
You know, I think it just felt right. It just felt like the right thing to do. To do everything all at once would have felt too heavy-handed.
Yeah, I think it would have been too heavy-handed. You know, I'm obviously aware of the dangers that women and men go through when they're crossing the border. But you can know that and not necessarily want to read it in you know, painful detail all the way along. So. So, you know, based on the 2016 publication date, this novel would have had to have been written in the pre-Trump era. So can you talk about the process and also the time of writing? Because I'm sort of wondering how the novel might have turned out differently, if it would have turned out differently, had it been written after Trump came into office? So, I mean, do you think the situation for undocumented immigrants from south of border stayed essentially the same, gotten worse, gotten better?
So Obama was no saint when it came to immigration. The book started during the Obama years, and it was published, I guess it was finished during the Obama years. It was published just after Trump's inauguration. So, I wanted to look at what was happening to people in this country. So much of what we see on the news is statistical, very generalized. And when you see something in the form of a news story, and in the form of statistics, it's easy to disengage from the humanity of the people going through these news events. So that was my main goal, to really dig into what people were saying to each other, what they were thinking, what it was to be human in this immigration scenario. And in terms of what Obama did versus what Trump did, I feel like the Obama administration, despite the family separation that did happen, was trying to approach immigration in a more thoughtful manner. Between the Dreamers, between the Central American Minors Program, which he started and then Trump pulled back and Biden is now reinstating. I feel like he was trying, with all his sort of political, all the political stuff he had to deal with, he was trying to be a little more human and thoughtful with his approach than the Trump administration, which essentially resorted to fear, to making people afraid to come to the border, which really is no way to handle a country's policy, in my opinion.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think you do an excellent job, really, of making us of humanizing, rehumanizing, but for some people, humanizing the situation in the first place. I, of course, went to look up the Encarnacion Bell Romero to see what had happened in her case, and it was such a sad situation. And reading about how the judge simply terminated her parental rights, it was almost like she was not human. She was a bad mother because she crossed the border.
Yeah.
So I think you really did make us feel how it might feel to be a person in that situation. Quick question: why Mexico? Why not Guatemala? Why not some other Central American country?
I felt like I had a better chance of getting to go to Mexico. I had more connections there than I had in any other Latin American country. So that's essentially what I was thinking of. I was thinking of research and where I would realistically be able to get myself.
Well, it's realistic anyway, because a lot of the people who do come over are certainly Mexican. But, so I wanted to ask you about the sort of identity ethnicity question. So I think I mentioned to you when we were just touching base before this, how much I enjoyed that scene with the aunties as Kavia's walking across the room. It felt so real. So I mean, obviously these are Indian aunties and not Mexican aunties, but it felt very realistic and authentic. But, in one thing that I was kind of curious about, because in the Encarnacion Bell Romero story, the adoptive parents are from Missouri and they're white, right? The judge who terminates her are also white. But in the novel, your potentially adoptive parents are Indian American, and the mother is a former Berkeley activist, okay? So in my view, I think you do an excellent job of representing Kavia's intense, and if I may say so, somewhat selfish desire for a child. She's not the only one who's selfish in this book, by the way. Sully can be quite selfish in her own way. But would you talk about that choice to make the couple Indian rather than white? And the reason I say this is because it's really easy for me to understand how a white couple might be completely insensitive to this Guatemalan immigrant mother's plight, really kind of dehumanize her in a way that would you know,
Mhm.
but it was harder for me to understand how Kavya, as a former activist and somebody who works daily with a Mexican coworker, Miguel, how she could be so, I don't know, insensitive, unwilling to confront the ethical dilemmas that her actions posed.
Yeah, that was something that my understanding of Kavya and Rishi evolved, I think, as I was writing the book. So when I started writing them, I make almost all my characters Indian unless there's a reason for them not to be Indian. So I started that way. And I only later realized that this isn't, you know, this wasn't a book about a white couple taking away a Mexican woman's child or wanting to do that. This was more a novel about how different people who are immigrants or who are the children of immigrants experience this country, how this country unfolds differently for different categories of immigrants. So, you know, halfway through the book, I started to realize that actually it's very important that they're not white and that that Kavya and Rishi are second generation immigrants, and that they have a plug into that. And I didn't want Kavya to be an insensitive, you know, dehumanizing monster.
Well, she's not.
Yeah,
I didn't
she's
mean to
not, and
lie.
that just isn't, it's not interesting to write. I don't think it's interesting to read when someone's just flat out blind to a situation. For me, the interesting thing about her is that she knew what she was doing. She knew the cultural, personal, political ramifications of what it was to be trying to adopt a Mexican woman, a Mexican immigrant's child. And she knew as a mother what it was, just mother to mother. She knew what she was doing to this woman. So I had to get her to a place where she was willing to blind herself. She was willing to be deaf to what her better voices were telling her because of her love for this boy. I think it was a
Yes,
challenge for myself. And I
yes,
found that
yes.
interesting.
Yes, well, it was good. You know, I read a lot. And so you know, but I can see that, and I think you didn't only do that with Kavi. You did it with Rishi. You know, where there's a certain point, like when he breaks into Soli's parents' house. Like, I'm just thinking, what are you thinking? How can you be so? And Soli, you know, Soli, when she shows up at their home and basically breaks in there and kidnaps her son away. So all of them cross these boundaries, these borders, in ways that, you know, I'm sitting over here just, you know, thinking, oh my God, what are you doing? So I think, you know, you have indicated in various ways that the whole idea of borders, boundaries is important to you, and, you know, walking that line. Can you say more about that?
Yeah, I think there are many borders beyond the geographical border in our lives and in this book. So with Rishi, you know, for one thing, he was working on this project for a Silicon Valley company, which also dealt with borders, the passage of VOCs in the air.
Yes.
From outside a building to inside a building. You know, there was that idea of the border. And there was the idea of the borders of what we're willing to do for our own happiness, for this idea of the American dream, or for this very, I think, Silicon Valley idea that if you want something, it's yours to go get. You just have to figure out how to make it happen.
Right.
And sometimes those aspirations, as inspirational as they can be, they don't pay heed to the people that they're trampling, that they're walking over.
Right. We saw that sort of embodied in Vikram Sen. You know, there was that kind of little a painful moment when he calls up Rishi and says, TED Talk, you're going to do a TED Talk. And Rishi, bless his heart, thinks for a moment that he's going to do a TED Talk.
Right.
And then the minute you hear Vikram laughing, I actually figured, like, no way was Vikram ever going to let him take any credit for this work. It was always going to go up to Vikram, you know.
Yeah, I had to figure that out. Rishi was a tough nut to crack in terms of fatherhood and his connection to Ignacio, and in terms of his career and why, why his career was in the book in the first place. I had to figure out how to make that actually relevant to the rest of the story. And Vikram Sen, I think, was probably my favorite character to write.
Oh, that's so funny, really?
He was just fun to write. He had this great personality. He stepped all over things that he shouldn't be stepping on, and he loved writing his voice. Yeah.
Well, I'm so interested to hear you say that he was probably your favorite character. I was going to ask you that. So, I mean, in a way, this sort of reminds me a little bit about, I have a graduate student, former graduate student, who's now an assistant professor, and she wrote about the figure of the dictator in the novel, because there's something about the writer as dictator, right? As the one who can basically trump all over everybody to make things happen in the way they want them to happen. So I hear a little bit about that, hear about that from in your answer there. Does that make sense to you?
Yeah, that makes sense to me. Vikram Sen didn't have a lot of stakes in the story. He didn't have a lot to lose at all. And I think that may be what made him a bit more fun. He didn't, his character wasn't so fraught as the others. I could sort of relax with him a bit. Yeah.
So, this novel really lingers quite lovingly on the minutiae of a privileged Berkeley life. We get that in the characters of the Cassidys, who of course have their, what you might call first world problems. But also in Rishi and Kavya, you realize how privileged they are, even though they may or may not perceive themselves to be that way. But I've never lived in Berkeley, but I've visited, so I have a very clear mental image of that. But I do teach at Stanford, and Stanford is in the heart of Silicon Valley. So there were things in the novel that were at times familiar and maddening. So tell me why you focused on Berkeley and what was at stake for you in inserting the Silicon Valley element into the novel.
So Berkeley, I started with Berkeley, first of all, because it's where I live, but I'd never really written about it before. I think Berkeley became important as a setting because I didn't want Soli to have a lonely experience. We see a lot of narratives, like if I think of Jhumpa Lahiri and her stories, her novels, her immigrants tend to be lonely. They tend to live in like cul-de-sacs where people pull their SUVs out of their garages and no one sees anyone. I wanted Soli to bump up against a lot of other people, which happens in Berkeley when you're walking down the street. I also didn't want this to be a really horrible experience for Soli. I didn't want her to be working in, say, a poultry plant for inhuman hours, inhuman wages. In a way, I wanted to give her a resting space. The first part of her life in Berkeley is actually, it's okay. She has an okay job. She works for a relatively okay family. She has some security. She has some comfort. And so I wanted Berkeley to be that place that wasn't going to be, that was maybe going to be welcoming to an undocumented immigrant more than maybe other places within the US. But with that welcome, that welcome isn't complete. There's still complexity to that. There's still discomfort in Berkeley for Soli. Berkeley's this place that's chock full of good intentions, and it doesn't always play out that way in real life, which I think is interesting. Yeah.
Yes, in hearing some other people talk about the novel, they have mentioned the Cassidys as kind of the stereotypical liberal Berkeley-ites. But Rishi and Kavya also are in their own ways kind of liberal in that sense, good intentions, but sometimes, amazingly blind to the impact that their own privilege has on others.
Yeah, they're one of those people who who have beliefs, but their beliefs are never really tested. So they are liberal politically, socially, but they're very comfortable in being liberal, in that they've never had to question, how far their liberalism goes, what they're willing to put themselves through in order to honor their ideals.
Yeah, I have to say, near the end, I really, there's what should happen narratively, and there's what you hope will happen for the character. I mean, if you've invested in the character, and I really just wanted Kavya to get pregnant. Like I just wanted. I knew it would have been like a Disney ending had you made her get pregnant all of a sudden, but there was that part of me that just wanted her to be able to have her baby. And Rishi too. They would have been amazing parents, so.
Yeah, I wanted that very badly for Kavya, but it just didn't feel right it felt too pat, too tidy to give her that. But it's not, she's not without hope. It's not the end of her motherhood story in my mind. I think
Good.
Something can happen for her.
Yes, that's great.
Yeah.
So, I understand that you had some difficulty getting the novel published at first, and that it ended up going through several rounds of revision. I know you've indicated, oh, maybe you should just made them all white. I understand that impulse, that thinking, that line of thinking. I'm glad you didn't. It would have been much less interesting, I think, to me, had it just been that simple.
Right.
But one revision you have mentioned was changing the ending. So I am curious, how did you change it, and how did you originally want it to end?
Yeah, the original ending. So I went out with the book, I guess in like 2013, or 2012, 2013, around then. And the original ending at that time was to have Soli not get Ignacio back, to have her basically stay at that weird chicken restaurant. That I put her in for a while, and to accept the fact that her son was with this other family, and she would send him money, and that was her way of keeping a connection. And Kavya would sort of quietly receive this money, knowing somewhere in her heart where it came from, and not really being sure what to think of that, what to do with that. So an uncomfortable victory for Kavya, I guess. And the reason I changed it is because I didn't think it did justice to what Soli had put herself through to have a child, to get back to her child. You don't stab a man in the thigh and jump out a window and run into the middle of nowhere in order to just give up. So I think that original ending just, it wasn't Kavya, and it didn't do her justice. And as crazy as the current ending is, it does her justice, I think.
I think it's plausible. So I know I was listening to, I wish I could remember her name. There was a scholar who recently wrote a book about El Centro, which is a detention center down in California. I think it's actually closed now, but it was open from like 1945 to how early on, when it was first opened, the detainees would just run away. They would just leave until the US became better and better and better about keeping them incarcerated. And of course, now I know that we have what are essentially private prisons all over the country. And it would be almost impossible for people to escape. So that it was right at that point where, if I'm being, I don't know, I'm like, how realistic is that? So that she could get out of that. But it was plausible. I thought it was plausible. And so I was happy that she got her son back, even as I think it would have been an amazing, confluence of events that it could work out that she would be able to do that. But it was, she went and she was waiting, and she just happened to take advantage of a situation at a particular moment. So
yeah.
Has anybody accused you of making it too happy at the end, or
making it too happy at the end?
Or
people are definitely of two minds. Or, my readers definitely have two different opinions about who should have gotten Ignacio in the end.
Oh,
There are
that's
plenty of
interesting.
people who think that Kavya should have ended up with him.
Oh, that's interesting.
So yeah. And, we read fiction for these dramatic turns, for these
Yes.
things that play with plausibility.
Yes.
Otherwise, there's a ton of wonderful, narrative journalism out there. But we read fictions for these little leaps of our hearts, for our pulse to race.
Yes.
Now and then.
Yes. So when people talk to you about Iggy staying with his mother, Kavya, what is their rationale?
That Kavya and Rishi had this lovely, comfortable life, that they could give Ignacio every opportunity that he could possibly want, which is true. But does that mean that Kavya doesn't have, that Soli doesn't have a right to be a mother to her child?
Right.
And are we saying that a single mother of lower financial means is not a good mother? Is that what we're actually saying? Because I'm not comfortable saying that. And ultimately, Soli showed so much more grit, so much more like of a will to survive than Kavya did. And I think that's hugely important for a child to see in their parent.
Absolutely. I mean, I guess I would agree, but of course I was sort of the opinion that I wanted Soli to get her son back. So I, am biased in that way. Not that Kavya would not have been a good mother. I think I would feel a little bit differently if you had made the characters white, because what it means to be a person of color in this country is that you're going to face stuff. You're going to run into a lot of racial stuff. And this is something that sometimes white adoptive parents do not properly understand. And they very often do not prepare their poor children for what they're going to face. So, I mean, obviously, Kavya and Rishi are not white. And so there would have been some ability, perhaps. Yeah. But, the kid still would have grown up. He still would have known he wasn't Indian. Right. So then what?
Right. Yeah. I think that they'll make a wonderful pair of parents to another child, maybe a Latino child, but one that, doesn't have a mother who wants him back.
Yes.
There is, the thing is that there's, in this country, an Indian American will have a different experience than a Latinx person. We are not treated equally just because we're both brown.
Right. Yeah. Well, money and clothing and status and what job you have, all of that makes a huge amount of difference. So, yeah. Yes. Well, it's not that I'm not, sensitive to adoptive parents. I think it was more the keeping him away from the mother who wanted him back thing that was mostly what I found problematic. So can I talk to you about Sylvia? Because nobody ever talks about Sylvia.
Yeah.
I actually liked Sylvia. I thought, she was, I think she came in for some criticism, that she didn't support Soli more. But, she was making a life. She gave Soli good advice, was good advice for someone who is working for people who, whose commitment to her sort of flourishing is delimited, And she provided her with a safe place. She never expected Soli to babysit her own sons. You know what I mean? She asked Soli to pay her own way. This all seemed to me very fair. Okay, maybe she had fudged the idea of the papers, but then Soli also fudged the idea of the papers.
Yeah.
And she ended up in a prison for that.
Yeah. Sylvia, I wanted her to be tough, and I wanted her to be tough with Soli. So she was there for Soli. She was a place for Soli to live safely. And she wasn't the sort of softest, sweetest person, but she had to be tough. Speaking of grit, she had to come into this country and find her way basically alone, as far as we know. So, she just had to be a tough cookie, and that's how I wrote her. So she's not always sympathetic or likable.
Yes. Yes.
And, the thing with papers and how everyone said that Sylvia had papers, I think that there's so many myths around American immigration that exist back in people's home countries. Whether it's about people who do have papers when they don't, whether it's people who have a wonderful, streets paved with gold life when they don't, when they're really struggling. And I think that's something that's been happening for centuries. The sort of
Oh, absolutely, for people from all different kinds of countries.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah. Well, I kind of liked her, but maybe I'm sympathetic to women with grit. So because it's not easy, I think, to be a someone who survives in the United States in a way that many of us are expected to survive, or thrive. So
yeah, she had her soft spots, but I think also when you are surviving, you let go of some of that comfort. It takes comfort to be able to be sweet and kind sometimes.
Another really interesting character is Uma. Yeah. So what were your models for Uma?
Yeah, Uma, Kavya's mom. To some extent, my own mother, in that, Uma does this thing where she's like, no, at the beginning, this is my entire life. My mom immediately is like, no. And then I just kind of work her, I massage the situation, and then I eventually get to a yes. So that definitely came from my mom. Uma's a little bit more of a hardliner than my mother is. My mom's sort of softer in general than she is. Definitely the why are you wearing black to this wedding? Where's your wedding necklace? Maybe Auntie has something you can change into. That's definitely.
Well, the minute she decided to wear black to the wedding, I'm thinking yeah. Well, I think one of my favorite little mini scenes was when Uma shows up to meet Iggy for the first time and brings him the little sweet that she immediately plops into his mouth. And then, of course, as she's leaving, she tells Cavett, "You're giving him too much sugar."
Right.
Yeah, I thought she was an interesting character.
Yeah.
I liked her a lot.
And I didn't want her to just melt as soon as she saw Iggy. I wanted there to be a little more, give and take that had to happen, a little more uncertainty on both their parts. So.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you a more general question. This is, what is your favorite part of the novel?
Oh gosh, my favorite part of the novel. I guess I have a couple different favorite parts. I really liked the stage when Soli was leaving Elmer's chicken restaurant. Like those scenes where this small community of other workers in that restaurant sort of take care of her. We see that there's a great deal of tenderness there. We see that they're almost like her family. They're sending her off again in this really beautiful, loving way. I really liked that. I liked conceptualizing just the weird stuff in this book, like that chicken restaurant. I remember my editor was like, "Can't you have her be somewhere more normal?" I was like, no.
Loved it. I really did like that, actually. Yeah. I'm perfectly willing to believe that there is a restaurant up in Seattle where people come in and pick their chicken and it's taken away. Right. Yeah, that made perfect sense to me. With a pretty decent human being running it. He wasn't a terrible person. He was pretty decent. He helped her, and a community of workers who would help her. Yeah. So I did like that quite a bit.
Yeah. And then with Kavya, I think I liked writing her scenes with Preeti Patel, her sort of nemesis, and sort
her
of
frenemy.
Her frenemy. And figuring out how that relationship was going to evolve and what it was going to bring to her.
Yeah, I'll bet that's going to be a relationship that will be wonderful and warm and important as they get older.
Yeah,
Right?
as they let go of the things from their childhoods and
Yeah.
rediscover
Yeah.
each other.
Yeah, I just, especially that scene where where Preeti is telling Kavya that her mother was like, oh, why can't you be like Kavya? Kavya is such a nice girl. She likes to cook. I'm thinking like those mothers kept them kind of at each other's throat the whole time while they were growing up.
Right,
So,
absolutely.
yeah. I guess another interesting discussion that showed up in the novel for me was the very little bit that you had Rishi say about the kind of genetic aspirations of the Indian parents.
Yeah, you know, we could trace this back to the caste system. We can talk about this in many different ways. But there is a lot of thought that goes into the traditional Indian marriage structure. If you look at like matrimonial ads in India, they're very, very specific about what they want for their child. It's almost as if you're shopping for an apartment or a car, you know, and you want all the like extras, you know, what's important to you, you know, what's not important to you. And really, no matter what you try to set up, you know, you can have the most carefully calibrated marital match, and you're still going to get someone who you don't expect. You get something you don't expect. But yeah, there is this idea of security in having control over one's future, which I think is a false assumption.
Yeah, like having control over the borders of one's heir, right? That you can, you know, control all of that. So, and I think that's been a bit of an important issue for you too, is like what's possible and what are we willing to do to get what we consider to be the impossible, which is, so yeah, we see that with Vikram Sen quite a bit.
Yeah.
So we're coming to close to the end of the hour. And so I just wanted to take a moment to invite people who are with us today to start putting questions into the Q&A. So I'm sure you've been sort of listening and waiting and thinking. And so I sort of want to open that invitation to you. I think that once they get in there, I can start bringing them forward to Shanthi. Okay, so there's my pitch, folks. Let's go ahead and hear it. So I want to talk about, as people are hopefully coming forward with some questions, talk to me about the metaphor of the earthquakes. So we talked about borders earlier. They show up in very many ways. What about earthquakes?
Yeah, so we who live in Berkeley, we kind of have in the back of our minds this idea that we could have a huge earthquake any day, any minute. And the earthquake in the novel is, it symbolizes what Kavya is setting herself up for, basically.
Right.
She knows, she suppressed the thought, but she knows that she is trying to adopt the child of another woman who doesn't want to give him up. She knows what she's doing is wrong. And at a certain point, that is going to come home to roost, that reality. So she's almost living in denial of that fact, in the way that we in Berkeley live in denial of the fact that there is like a fault going.
Well, it's not just Berkeley. I can tell you,
Yeah.
you know, I've been living here since 1996. And so I've been waiting since 1996 for the big one, but it hasn't arrived. And the problem is that the longer that we live here and it doesn't happen, the easier it is to imagine it's not going to.
Right. Yeah. And, you know, we try to prepare ourselves with like emergency backpacks and
Yes.
water and stuff.
Yes.
But when it happens, we won't be ready.
I know. Yes.
I think that pertains to so many things. You know, it's Kavya's situation, but it's also parenthood. We read all the books, we get all the stuff for parenthood, and we're just never ready until it happens.
Yes, I'm sure that's true. I had children myself so young that it's almost like ancient history. But no, I was not the least bit ready. I wish I had been more ready. I wish I had been older, frankly. So Yeah. So I'm wondering if you might want to talk a little bit about how this book resonated with the the Indian American community or the Indo-American community.
Yeah, so how did it resonate with the Indian American community? I think it was really well received. I haven't gotten a lot of sort of negative feedback from that community or from the Latinx community, actually. People definitely identify with the community that Kavya comes from. It reminds me in some ways of my own community. In the US, especially in California, where I grew up, we have these tight-knit communities because in the 60s and 70s, we had a handful of doctors, mostly medical professionals who were being recruited by the Johnson administration, kind of trickling into the country and forming very tight-knit communities because there weren't a lot of them. Whereas now with the influx of tech labor, we have a much greater influx of South Asian immigrants. But back then we clung to the people that we had, and there's a closeness there. And I see it when I go back to my family friends in Sacramento, where I grew up. There's like a warmth there, and I was kind of the brown sheep. But I'm not,
because you decided to go off and be a writer instead of a doctor.
Right. No one really knew what I was doing for a while. And I didn't follow the clean, sort of easy set path that is sometimes expected. And I still am able to go back to my parents' friends and feel like they're kind of like my next level parents. There's sort of a calmness and
it's like a family, right?
Yeah.
So we're starting to get some questions. Okay. So I'm going to, so one is, what were your literary models for this novel? Were they US? Were they South Asian? Were they Latinx? Writers from other cultural traditions? What limitations or opportunities did such possible model authors offer you?
So probably the most explicit model for me was Toni Morrison. And her book, Beloved, really helped me out when I was struggling and trying to solve the puzzle of this book. So when I originally wrote the book and originally sent it out, it was very chronological. We just went from step A to step B. And there was a certain amount of suspense missing there. So in later drafts, I decided to go back and mix up the chronology a little bit. So we have lots of flashbacks.
I see.
And what I did with that was to go back to Beloved, where Toni Morrison just so beautifully and so seamlessly weaves together past and present. And so I spent a summer reading that book again. I had a little notebook. I would write down, the actual sentences that she wrote so I could see how the words worked to play with time.
I love that. Yeah.
And I
She's
think
a good model.
Sorry?
She's a good model.
She's a good model. Yeah. And the closing page, the final paragraph of this book, I think was inspired by her final paragraph, which is almost incantatory in Beloved. I wanted to have that same feel. So artistically.
Sula too. I mean, well, a lot of her work, but yeah. So somebody else is asking, the character and the scenes you created are so vivid, Tatiana says, that I felt I could see them. Has there been an interest in a film version of your novel?
Yeah, we almost got it to be a TV show. It got really, really close. We pitched it a couple times to the various streaming networks. I had interest from a showrunner back in 2017 who loved the book, really wanted to see it made into something. Oh gosh, I'm blanking on her name. Like, this is really embarrassing. The lady from Desperate Housewives, Eva Longoria. Longoria.
Oh yes, I read about that. That's great. Yeah. But it didn't work out.
It didn't fly. She got on board. She was, pitching it with us. She was really great. We got to the stage where a deal was being hashed out with the network, and it just never, they couldn't hash out a deal. It just came to the financials. in the end.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that all fell through. I'd love to see it as a movie or a film. You know, I'd love to see these people brought to life with
I
that.
think it would be a lovely movie, actually. I mean, maybe a series, but you know, it's anyway, let me get on to another question. So Anonymous says that he, she, they really appreciated how you detailed the agony of Soli and her parents in deciding for her to come to the US. And was that inspired by anyone in particular or a culmination of many immigrant stories?
In terms of her parents, is that?
I guess, yeah, just how difficult it was for them to make the decision for
Mhm.
her to come. I mean, I think, well, remember the mother, she's refuses to come out of the room.
Yeah.
And the father, you know, he gives all his money to make this possible. So
Right.
they're doing it for their child. It's their
Right.
parenthood, right?
Yeah.
That is.
Yeah, you know, they really are sacrificing something for her because they see a future for her. And they don't see I guess they don't see a real future for their daughter in the place where they've chosen to live. It's almost becoming a ghost town. In terms of her experience of that, I think it was inspired by a whole lot of immigration stories. I know my own mother, my mother left in the middle of medical school to marry my dad and come to the
Wow.
US. And I
Wow.
remember her great aunt, who was like a mother to her, who raised her, she was pissed. She was really mad at her
Yeah.
mother for
In the
A,
middle
leaving
of,
medical school,
yeah.
and B, you know, going off to America back in the 60s when we didn't have WhatsApp and we didn't have
Yes.
Zoom.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. No, so Robin Gunn suggests that the description of the women working as undocumented domestic workers struck her as very authentic, but not having any personal familiarity with that experience. She's just wondering how you did research for those characters and also what sort of response you received from people who have been undocumented or their families.
Yeah. So the research that I did with undocumented domestic workers, I read a lot. I interviewed a few people who had been undocumented themselves and working in the US. And then I went to some extent with my own experience, you know, in terms of when I have a house cleaner as like a bougie Berkeley person,
Right.
how am I with them? What do I
Right.
think of? And some of this was like kind of embarrassing to think about. You know, I'm not as different from Mrs. Cassidy as I would like to
Right.
think.
Yeah.
So I had to get down to the everyday details of what it was to be
Right.
an undocumented worker. And then the psychology itself of being undocumented, I think, is
Yeah.
really important. And the low level constant uncertainty that comes with that. I think that also informs the experience of any worker, including domestic workers.
Right. No, I thought that was actually very, very good, to tell you the truth. Yeah. It just, I mean, as I said, my own daughters are in their, they may be older than you. I'm not sure how old you are, but they're in their mid to late 30s now. And oh, look, here's Gayatri. Anyway, so I did have a nanny who worked for me then. And so this took me back. Now we're years from that now.
Yeah.
So she actually did get pregnant. She ended up staying in my home. She ended up becoming a nanny for her baby and my babies too.
Okay. Yeah.
And that young woman is my goddaughter, and we're still in contact, and I'm still in contact with the mother. But it was interesting to see. It was same and different, you know. It was a long time ago. So
yeah. Great.
Gayatri, I see Gayatri there.
Yes, I'm here, and I will say that I had lots of questions, but I was so engrossed in this discussion that I forgot to put some of them. But the one question that I do want to ask you, Shanthi, is are you thinking about writing a sequel?
I've thought about it, and I've definitely had readers come up to me and tell me what they think should be in the sequel and how it should all play out. I'm like, okay, can you write
So
that
what-
down and email it?
It's almost like I want two of them. One
Yeah.
for, you know, Kavya and her
family.
journey, I would say, where she ends. And I always thought that, motherhood can be incredibly selfish.
Yeah.
And to me, that was the whole complexity is, we just will give anything for our children. And I think I was just really moved by that, regardless of how their decisions were.
Yeah.
So that was just really wonderfully done. But I also wanted to know about, Iggy and, what happens to Iggy's experience. So just please consider that.
Yeah, I think it would be really interesting to meet Iggy like 18 years from now, when he's grown up, when he like maybe learns about what happened to him, about this other family that were his parents. Maybe he remembers them to some extent. I don't know. And I also think about that in terms of Encarnacion Bail's son, the woman whose story first got me thinking about this. Someday he'll find the news reports. He'll know what happened to him. And so I think the child's point of view is something that I'd like to get into if I ever continue with this.
So Robin, who earlier talked about the women workers and what their experience, she definitely does not want you to write a sequel. Actually, I don't know if Robin's a woman or a man. Because it is one of those names that could be either. But for Robin, keeping the next chapter of Soli and Iggy's lives. Although, see, I always think of Soli and Nacho, but Iggy and Kavya, Soli and Nacho, but keeping their lives unknown, as Robin says, essential to the magic of the book. So
good, great. I'll go with that then.
Woman, Robin's a woman. So what do people, how do they want you to, what do they want to happen in the sequel?
Oh, some people want some people want Soli to come back to Berkeley and live with Kavya and Rishi and like be their nanny kind of. They want everyone to come together and be a family. I think that could be interesting. I think that approach, it wouldn't be easy. It wouldn't be one big happy family. It would be really complex and difficult in many ways and interesting. So that's one of the tracks that people's thought has taken. Yeah. And to answer the question about how undocumented people have reacted to this, that was from an earlier question. I have gotten some really positive feedback and emails from people who like the fact that somebody from outside of their community is taking the story on. And that was a hesitation, of course, that I had was, is this my story to tell? Can I tell the story of an undocumented woman? And I've been hearing from people that, having someone who is not one of them actually put the care and time into the story was important to them.
I think it was important to me too, that you did that. When I first opened the book and I had a sense of what it was about, I was like, oh God, let her do a good job. Yeah. And so, anyway, I think you did do a good job. I am one of these people that truly believes that you can write about people not like yourself, that is possible. And clearly you showed that is the case. So Ruthann Garcia is asking the question that I was just about to ask you, which is, can you tell us briefly about your next book?
Yeah, my next book. So the one that's about to come out in September, you can actually pre-order it now. Here it is. It's my next baby. It's called The Samosa Rebellion. And it's a middle grade book. So technically for readers who are 8 to 12 years old, but readers who are pretty strong. And it's one of those books that I hope will kind of be a crossover that adults will like as well. But it's about a 12-year-old boy named Muki, and his parents are from India, and he lives in a fictional country called Mariposa. And his country's government is becoming increasingly xenophobic and anti-immigrant. And he and his friends, his community, start a sort of homegrown revolution.
Oh, cool.
Yeah. And it's about him like being 12 as well. And his grandmother comes to live with them. And it's about, he has to share a room with his grandmother. And, it's about that evolving relationship as well.
That sounds fabulous.
Yeah.
There's really has been a growth in these young adult novels. I guess this is, well, middle grade. I suppose that's young adult. One that my husband and I taught recently was Not Your Perfect Mexican Daughter. Have you had a chance to read that?
I haven't read that one yet.
Oh, you should read it. It's really, really quite good.
Yeah.
I think.
Great.
So, yes. So do you have anything else that you want to bring up about this? Or I should ask Gayatri, do you have any further questions, Gayatri, before we?
Many, but
Okay.
I know that we are coming to the end of this program. And I will say that it was just wonderful getting to know, you learn, you read a book and you think you know the author. And so when you listen to the author, then you get those nuances. So I'm very thankful that Palo Alto Library was able to bring that to many. And Paula, you were a fantastic moderator, and you asked a lot of questions that we all wanted to ask. I almost was forcing myself not to come back and ask all the questions.
I wanted to ask Shanthi one more thing, which is,
Sure.
Was there anything that I didn't bring up that you really want your readers, your audience to know?
Something that I didn't mention earlier was that I thought really hard about writing Soli's story, since her experience is so unlike me. And since people like her have so much less privilege than I do as a documented, or, as a person who was born here. And in writing this, I had to think as much about, in writing this, I had to really be comfortable with everything that I didn't know. So with Soli as a Mexican woman, as somebody who doesn't have immigration documents, I was able to create a story out of that because I'm a novelist, because that's what I do. But there's still so much that I don't know about this experience, and I really had to come to terms with that very, very early on. So I just wanted to put that out there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I'll turn it back over to you, Gayatri, if you.
Well, I did want to say, thank you again for this fabulous experience. Hope we can do this again in person at some point. And also, really many thanks to the Lead Center for not only collaborating in this particular event, but also the entire year. That was one of the silver linings for us during this whole COVID experience, is to really expand our virtual offerings. And Lane Center has been our partner for all those author events that we've done. So we're just really glad that that happened. And also to the audience, I mean, Palo Alto Library is beloved to everybody that lives in Palo Alto and even outside. And we could not have done any of these things without their support. I know that many of them were here, but I also know many that didn't come, but then they'll be watching the recording. There is the recording, and also reading the book. And I can't help saying that this is part of our summer reading. So please sign up and have your friends and family sign up. There are more events coming up, including wacky events days and many other fun things. So please go and participate in them and, read. So
great.
That I'm going to say good night and thank you again for everybody that attended.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Paula.
Thank you all.
Well.
I really enjoyed it. It was very nice to meet you.
Great to meet you too. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.